Welcome back to another episode of the Victory Over Vices podcast, brought to you commercial-free by addictionhelp.com. I am your host, Dan Hauser, and on this week's show, we're going to take a look at the relationship between marijuana and professional sports in this country with Dr. Natalie Klag from The Ohio State University. Let's get into the show. All right, so today, 24 states have made marijuana legal recreationally. As of this recording on November 28th, 2023, there are actually fewer states in the country where it's still illegal than there are where it's legal in some capacity. That being said, at the federal level, it is still illegal. And for the most part in this country, when it comes to professional and even most amateur sports, it is still considered illegal. We have, however, over the last couple of years, seen a shift where some professional sports leagues specifically are starting to kind of change their tune when it comes to marijuana as a whole. And that started in 2020, in March of 2020 specifically, after COVID hit. And so once COVID hit, we all remember the entire sports world shut down. I'm sure everyone kind of remembers where they were that night when slowly one by one, sporting events were being canceled. Leagues were announcing they were completely shutting down. The NCAA basketball tournament was going on. Conference championships were going on. And leagues were essentially just shutting down in the middle of games as everyone was kind of trying to navigate this new world that we were going to start living in. And so one of the first leagues to come back was the NBA, because the NBA and the NHL still had not finished. They hadn't even completed their regular seasons yet. So the NBA created, as we all remember, this bubble atmosphere in Orlando on the property of Disney World. Basically, in a time where nobody really knew what was going on, the NBA said, hey, we're going to get all our players together. We're going to create this artificial bubble at Disney World, Wide World of Sports. We're going to send everyone there. They're going to test before they get there. They're not going to be able to leave once they get there. We'll bus them to and from to games, and everything's going to be as controlled as humanly possible. And so you can imagine these athletes at the time, it's already stressful enough. They're now being removed from their families in some situations. They're being told that they basically have to isolate themselves with the exception of when they go play a game. And so, through negotiations with the players and the league, it was determined that just for that time period when they were in the bubble, they were going to relax the rules when it came to marijuana. And so, the NBA players would be able to essentially use weed during the bubble. So now today, not only is weed no longer tested for in the NBA or part of their banned substance list, but now we're starting to see that same thing happen in both Major League Baseball and in the NHL. None of those leagues have marijuana on their banned substance list anymore. The one league that has kind of not followed suit yet is the NFL. However, you would have to imagine with all these other leagues starting to adapt, it'll only be a matter of time until the NFL, follows suit, and we could even see that happen as soon as the next CBA negotiations that come up. So obviously, as you can imagine, there are many athletes that are currently playing today that obviously are advocates and are in support of being able to use marijuana. So they're all happy, but you would have to imagine in kind of a better late than never mindset, there are a lot of probably former athletes that are happy to finally see a day come now where marijuana has become more acceptable in sports. You look at guys like Ricky Williams, Calvin Johnson from the NFL, Nate Diaz, UFC fighter, Marshawn Lynch, also former NFL player, and Allen Iverson, former NBA player. They all admitted to, some of them while they were still playing, like Ricky Williams, admitted to using weed during their playing days. They are now all involved in the cannabis industry today. In one way or another, many of them have actually their own strains of marijuana that they sell. For so many of them, the argument is that, marijuana is a healthier, more natural substance for things such as pain management, mental health issues, and so many things that these athletes up until now their only option was potentially dangerous opioids or narcotics, or they may have turned to alcohol to try to help ease the pain both physically and mentally. And so, their argument being, well, hey, if I can just go back to my house, go back to my hotel room if I'm on the road, I can smoke a little weed, I can take an edible, I can do something from that nature, It's less harmful on my body, and I'm also less likely to get in trouble as a result of maybe, drinking and driving, or, taking some opioids and it causing problems, or going out and not having that clear frame of mind when you're out. You're less likely to do those things, is a big argument they've had, as far as giving reasons why they think that they should be able to use marijuana. So this has been the argument. However, the question now becomes, is there any actual validity to it? And so who better than to ask that question to and further discuss this topic with than Dr. Natalie Klag, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at The Ohio State University, and she is going to join us right after the break. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to the show, everyone. As promised, as I teased off the top, I am joined again this week by Dr. Natalie Klag, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at The Ohio State University. Natalie, thank you so much for joining me again this week.
It's great to be back. Excited to be here.
So as we discussed a little bit off the air before, as we were getting ready for the show, the topic du jour of this week is kind of the growing relationship we have seen over the last few years, specifically between marijuana in this country and athletics in this country. So obviously at the collegiate level and at the amateur level, it is still very much a banned thing. It's still not accepted in the NFL. We'll get to that a little more here in a few minutes. But in the NBA and the NHL and Major League Baseball now, it has either been their version of the decriminalized, you could say, removed from their banned substance list, or in the case of the NBA, I believe they don't even test for it anymore all around. So a big reason for this is because, and this has been happening much longer than just the last few years, for decades and decades now, athletes have been advocating and kind of stating their case as to why they feel they should be able to use marijuana. We talked about it a little bit before you came on in the intro segment. They feel that it's a more natural alternative for healing, both physically and mentally, than opioids or narcotics or even alcohol to an extent. So beyond the fact that weed in and of itself is a natural substance, it grows out of the ground, it is typically handled naturally. Is there any validity, in your opinion, to the argument that these athletes have that it is a more natural, less harsh form of pain management when it comes to both physical pain and as well as mental pain?
So when we think about cannabis, I want to separate it into two things. There's THC and there's CBD. So I think it's important to recognize that those are the two big things that we talk about when we think about cannabis. Additional to that, there's like over 100 things that are included in cannabis itself. So when we think about those two, so THC is the one that we think of that's like the psychoactive stuff, the stuff that might make people psychotic, might give people changes in their mental state, whereas CBD is no psychoactive properties. That's the one that we think of more when we think about pain management and things like that. So I think it's really important to make that distinction off the top, because I think when we talk about the use of cannabis, weed, marijuana, whatever you want to call it, in sports, it's important to recognize that the different properties that you see from the different components are going to play a different role for people. So mostly when we're thinking about athletes, a lot of what they talk about and wanting to have the benefit from is the CBD portion of cannabis. So when we think about CBD, it has been shown that it does show some benefit for acute pain. So it's not necessarily that it's pain management as we would normally think of, but it helps decrease the mental distress that comes from pain and decrease the perception of pain. And honestly, that's even at a moderate dose of THC. So people don't have to have these high THC amounts with their CBD in order to get that benefit. That doesn't show any benefit. So there's also for sleep, which athletes talk a lot about poor sleep. They talk about not getting enough sleep, not getting a quality sleep. So CBD has shown really good benefits for sleep. And then there's also, in the growing discussion of concussions in sports, there's a lot of evidence that CBD could potentially help decrease the damage done from concussions, because CBD works on our inflammatory system. And so CBD with concussions can decrease brain inflammation. It might increase the ability of the brain to kind of heal itself. So one of the things to know about a lot of the research that's been done on cannabis is that it's been done in what we'd call a diseased population, populations that have a pre-existing illness. There haven't been a lot of studies on healthy, elite athletic performers. So a lot of the things that we're drawing these conclusions from is data that we're extrapolating from these more diseased populations. So it's hard to know exactly what the benefit would be for athletes, but from these other ill populations, we can see that there is benefit that athletes themselves might be able to garnish. But until, we can get that FDA regulation from cannabis and CBD, it's going to be hard to really know. But definitely from what we know now, there's some things that they could really get some benefit from.
So from the mental health side of things, which is kind of your domain, we've seen some studies over the years, as far as the healing properties are concerned with cannabis on the mental health side of things, PTSD specifically. I know there's been some studies done involving anxiety and depression and some other mental conditions. I guess I could say to the best of your ability, can you kind of take us through, I guess you could say, how exactly the healing properties within cannabis kind of interact with the brain, whether it's to help calm it down or to help, handle, in the case of PTSD, handle some of those kind of flashbacks or whatever. Kind of how does that, how does it all work? I guess you could say in kind of layman's terms, how does that interaction kind of, basically how does that interaction pretty much work?
Yeah. So when someone's using marijuana, THC and CBD is kind of the combination for this. When you think about PTSD, it helps them relearn those traumatic memories in a place where they feel calmer. So it allows them to re-experience, go work through those events, those traumas, those things they've been through. And it allows them to change the way that their mind is processing those traumas, the way that they feel their bodies respond to those traumas. It keeps them calmer when they're envisioning those traumas so they don't have quite that heightened experience. A lot of people talk about using marijuana for anxiety. With that, it does create this cycle where you calm down because you're using cannabis, but you're not actively learning those skills to manage anxiety. So when we talk with people who are actively using cannabis and don't have the intention to stop, one of the things that we really highlight is if you're going to use it for anxiety, you still need to make sure you're learning those skills to manage your emotions. Because if not, you're going to just get in this feedback cycle where you calm down, but the only way that you can calm down and manage your anxiety is with cannabis. So we often talk to people about, well, if that's what you decide is helpful, that's their decision. But it's really important to continue to work on those skills to manage it as well. And sometimes people find that if they're in a calmer state because of cannabis, it's easier to learn those skills if they have the support to do so.
In 24 states in this country, marijuana is legal recreationally. I believe in Ohio, you're one of those 24 states, if I have that correct. 38 states and Washington, D.C. have it legalized medically. So I mentioned this earlier. At this point, basically, there are fewer states where it's not legal than states where it is legal, at least in some capacity. It's obviously not legal at the federal level. And up until basically COVID forced the NBA's hand to an extent, it was not legal in any capacity in any professional or even amateur sport. And it still isn't in many of them. Why do you think it's taken so long, I guess you could say, for sports in general to kind of get on board with the state? Because if you think about it, you're in the state of Ohio. So you take a player at Ohio State University. For any other student on the campus, it would be legal for them to go get it and to smoke it, and it's perfectly recreationally legal. If one of the players on the football team did it, and they popped a positive on a drug test this weekend, they're not playing, or I guess it wouldn't be this weekend, but they wouldn't have played last week. They wouldn't be playing in their next game. Why have these sports leagues been so, in your opinion, apprehensive to kind of get on board and to allow it in the same way that so many of these other states are now saying, yeah, okay, if you want to do it, you're an adult, do it.
First of all, thank you for the heartbreaking reminder that we will not be playing this weekend. Thank you so much. So, I think one of the things we need to look at is like the historical perspective. So when a substance gets banned, it has to meet 2 of 3 criteria from the anti-doping agency. So it has to be the potential to enhance performance, it has to present some sort of health risk to the athlete, or it has to violate the spirit of the sport. So think about this in the context of, like in football, when there's a play on the field and then they review it. If the play can't be totally seen as indisputable evidence, it's going to stand as called, right? So when the decision was made in 2004 to put cannabis on the banned substance list, they were doing the best they had with the information they had in 2004. So that was the play that was called on the field. Cannabis is out. You can't have that. I mean, when we think about it, so there are studies that show a potential health risk for cannabis, but it's in patients with significant coronary artery disease. But it did show decreased time to exhaustion, concern for increased heart risk, the potential to enhance performance. It's anti-inflammatory. Is it going to help with muscle repair? Is it going to help in recovery? Is it going to make it so that they can perform better under stress because they're not as anxious? Does it violate the spirit of the sport? Well, considering its legal status, you don't want athletes doing things that are illegal. That's not going to look good for the league. That's not going to be perceived as these people who were watching setting a good example. So it goes into that ethical part. So I think in 2004, when the decision was made to put it on the list, they looked at the evidence that they had at those times, the studies that they had at those times, and they made a decision. And so I think since that time, in the 19 years since then, we've been looking for the video evidence to be able to overturn the play. And we just haven't had that. We don't have that firm evidence to say it's, overturned. So I think right now we can't say it's a confirmed call, but I think we have to say it stands as called at this point.
I love it. I love that analogy. And that does make sense. It's a fantastic analogy. So to play devil's advocate here, once again, just for a second, because,
Sure.
It's only fair to look at it from both sides. So let's just say we're prior to 2020, because obviously COVID changed so much in the world. So we're going to throw 2020 out because, COVID was COVID. So in 2019,
Right.
You're an NBA player. You have a prescription for Adderall. You have a prescription for fill in the blank with a substance that is medically prescribed to you, but it can be considered something that can also be abused. It's also something that can be highly addictive or a higher risk of abuse involved in it. You have that prescription. You have been told by the league, yep, you can take that as long as you can produce your prescription. It's fine. We're not going to suspend you or fine you for testing positive for speed. You are medically prescribed Adderall. That is okay, even though, there's arguments that can be made that Adderall, like so many things, there's a risk for dependency, abuse, and whatnot. Okay. Or you have a prescription for medical marijuana for this. Maybe it's for the exact same reasons that you might have had that prescription for the other drug. The league is telling you that drug that so many people view as more dangerous is okay, and marijuana is not okay. And so I don't want to say where the league's focusing on the wrong thing, but once again, it goes back to, were they being a little too close-minded and not accepting the fact that, yes, we do understand that there was this negative connotation, and for a very long time, this was an illegal substance. But you know what? Just like everything else in life, we've evolved. We evolve every year with our league rules, with our baseball. Literally last year changed the whole game. They put the pitch clock in. Leagues constantly are evolving when it comes to their own rules. Why not evolve when it comes to what's going on outside of their little bubble of the league office and what's going on in the actual world?
Mm-hmm. So I think I'd like to phrase the question differently and say, is it that they were focused on the wrong thing, or is it that they were reacting in the wrong way, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I think the idea of, was it an incorrect focus? I would say no, because it still stood in its illegal status in a lot of places, and that's, its own stuff. But I think this idea of this hard line of good and bad, you can't have this even if it serves a medical purpose. You can't have this if it serves a medical purpose. I think the biggest question that wasn't being asked, and I think the thing that is starting to be asked, I'd like to believe, is why? Why are you using this substance? Why do you need it, right? With things like Adderall, with things like buprenorphine, we know why people are using those. And so it's easy to say, yes, there's a medical indication for that. But I think with cannabis, there's been such a wide net of why people say they're using it. And I think that is where things got muddy in a lot of situations. So I think often people don't see marijuana as an addictive substance, but it really can be very addictive for people. So I think that's one thing that needs to be kept in mind. And I think really this serves as a bigger reminder of the resources that need to be available to the players just as much as to the general population. Because again, if they're using this substance for a reason that they perceive as beneficial, I think rather than looking at what is the substance in the league getting hung up on this versus this versus this, I think the bigger question is, why do we have these players that are using this thing that we've repeatedly told them they can't, but they continue to use it? There's clearly something there, whether it's addiction, whether it's mental health symptoms, whether it's pain. And I think this, honestly, my hope is that this would serve as an open invitation and door to teams to consider the resources that they need to have available for their players. Things like, do we need to have more of a focus on having a team physician, psychiatrist who can address these mental health concerns? Do we need to have a wider net of pain management options for these people? Just things to think about what they can offer to figure out what is behind it, because it's not as clear cut with cannabis as it is with a lot of the other prescribed medications on the banned substance list. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And you kind of beat me to my next point here too. You look at some relatively famous instances involving weed in sports over the years. Ricky Williams famously retired because he didn't want to stop smoking weed. Not to continue to bring up sore subjects in your neck of the woods, but you look at what happened with Josh Gordon there with the Cleveland Browns, repeatedly getting suspended. He would get suspended for testing positive for weed. He'd come back, and then immediately he'd test positive again. You look at just 2 years ago, Sha'Carri Richardson, the sprinter for Team USA, was all set to go and compete in Tokyo. She tested positive for marijuana, and she was banned from competing in those Tokyo Olympics. So, doubling down on your point, at some point, don't you have to say, if you're these leagues, if you're these team owners, or and whatnot, instead of just saying, oh, well, you did something you're not supposed to do, get lost and don't talk to us anymore. Like, isn't there an obligation on these leagues to say, well, wait a minute, why are they continuing even after we have told them they can't do this? Why are they continuing to do this? Beyond just, are they doing it because there's a positive thing that they're doing that they're not looking at? You mentioned too, could it go beyond? Could they have some sort of issue, dependency or whatever it is with marijuana? Are they doing it because it really truly is helping them and the league is just turning a blind eye to it? So it's and like I said, now COVID forced the NBA's hand, and then some other leagues have followed suit. So you wonder, if COVID had never happened, would they have come around on it? But at some point, you mentioned it, you feel like the leagues have to do something, and even if they don't want to accept it, they need to. I would at least, like you mentioned, do their due diligence to say, okay, why is this continuing to happen?
Yeah. I was reading an interview that Josh Gordon did. One of the things that he brought up in the interview was that he started to deal with significant mental health concerns when he was young, like very young. When people use substances young, the frontal lobe of your brain is not developed until you're in your mid-20s. So we're talking children, even the children playing NCAA sports, these are still children. They are not fully neurologically developed. And so when you think about the stress and the budding mental health symptoms that happen at that age group, when people in that age group turn to substances, it changes their brain circuitry for the rest of their life. It makes them so much more primed to have addiction issues, because they are teaching their brain, this is the only way you're going to get a positive feeling. All of the praise, all of the TV deals, all of the money, all of the fans won't do it the way that a substance does. And so when you think about somebody who starts using substances at a really young age to treat their mental health symptoms, it's going to be really hard to come back from that. And so one of the other things he talked about was having a huge trauma burden. He had been exposed to multiple traumas in his young life. And so PTSD is a prime reason that people self-medicate with these substances. And one of the things is the nature of addiction. It's an ongoing, chronic, relapsing, remitting disease. So when we understand addiction as a disease that comes and goes, is better sometimes, is worse other times, things spark it to get worse, just like any other chronic illness we think of, hypertension, diabetes. We have to understand that people are going to struggle on and off with this for a really long time. And so I think when we think about, these people who have had these negative consequences, they have the world at their fingertips, right? They could be the best player in the history of ever, right? For this one thing. But there's something about their brain that tells them, but without this thing, I cannot feel good. And so I think I think the leagues have a responsibility to these people, because athletes, just like you or I, have lived a life. They've had experiences that make it hard to deal with life today. And it's important to understand that those things are going to continue to be issues no matter how much we pay them, no matter how many seats are in the stadium, no matter what deals they get, they're going to still have those issues. And so when we have these people who continue to turn to things that they shouldn't, that for one reason or another is causing them harm, I think it's important to ask the bigger question of why. Because there's almost always a why. There's almost always a bigger why. And it gets really easy to shake our fingers and say, you should do better. But I think that's an unrealistic expectation, because athletes, just like us, are human.
So
Sorry, that was my soapbox. Sorry.
Oh, no, it was great. So at the most basic of levels, like we're taking everything, all the properties, everything aside. So athlete gets hurt. Maybe they take a Toradol shot, get prescribed a painkiller. We obviously know through history, we know the negative effects down the line that Toradol shots can have on an athlete's body, on these opioids can have on their body, and both physically and mentally. Personal feelings of marijuana aside, and personal feelings about, the dangers of it aside, if we're going to continue allowing Toradol shots in these locker rooms, opioids in these locker rooms, other types of narcotics in these locker rooms, is it really going to make things any worse, so to say, if we were to then allow marijuana in these locker rooms as another, not as the only option, but as another option available?
I think we're at a very critical point with cannabis, where we are at a place of increasing availability that is increasing much faster than our medical knowledge about the substance. And so doctors, other medical providers, we know about it. We've seen the dangers of it. We've had a lot of lectures about how illegal it is, but we don't know how to manage it appropriately, how to dose it appropriately, where it can be harmful and where it might not be. And I think when we think about the dangers of providing care with something that we're not as well educated on as we could be, I think we have the potential for a very slippery slope. I'm thinking similarly to the pain is the sixth vital sign. Here, give them this oxycodone and all of a sudden everything is good, right? We could slip down a slippery slope. Do I think we're entering a stage where I think it could be more dangerous? No, I think we need to proceed with caution. And I think because of the increasing availability, I think we as medical providers need to take it on ourselves to learn as much as we can about this, because regardless of what the legality of it is in anywhere, it's going to be something that we're dealing with. It's going to be something that people still want to use, need to use, find a use for. And so while I think for the sports world, I think it's going to continue to grow in availability, I think that should only be motivating to the scientific and medical community to figure out how can we make this safe? How can we figure out how to use this appropriately so that we don't cause harm like we've done in the past with other things that we saw as the end all be all greatest treatment that we could offer.
It's still very much in the infant early stages. I mean, it's been going on for a few years now, but when you think about how long, scientific studies go on, this one is still pretty infant, but, there have been studies now being done on kind of psychoactive properties in interacting with athletes' brains and being able, you mentioned, especially with PTSD, and being able to help kind of repair some of the more stronger mental health issues, especially post playing. We see a lot of these athletes, they retire. They're still in a lot of physical pain. They're in a lot of mental pain. They're not really sure what to do with themselves. They may find themselves turning to drugs or alcohol. So once again, the psychoactive properties that exist in THC, studies have started there. So even if beyond just current athletes, so we've kind of talked a bunch about where it fits in the lexicon of current athletes in leagues. Is there something there? And once again, I know we're still really early, but from what you've seen, is there something there that could be helpful down the line for athletes once they post career and they're retired? Is marijuana, are we getting to a point where marijuana may be a safer alternative for them than continuing to have to take painkillers or continuing to feel like they need to drink? Not that I'm saying that they just go out and get it, but maybe if it's working with a mental health professional to kind of help guide them through the proper ways to do it, even, is there something that, could we see a point where beyond just current athletes that it may actually be something that can help retired athletes to kind of better navigate their post-playing lives?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely think that there could be a place for that in like the retirement stage for a lot of these elite athletes. So there's an athlete, her name is Joanna Ziegler. She was an Olympic triathlete, and she went on to get her PhD, which I was like, wow, what a woman. That's totally awesome. But she's done a ton of research about the use of cannabis as a retired athlete, because she experienced tons of injuries like broken ribs and all these things. So she's no longer able to compete at that elite level. But she talks a lot about how, she had to do a lot of self-experimentation between, what's the ratio of THC to CBD that was required to help her manage her sleep, her pain, things like that. And I think it's encouraging to see somebody like her who has this lived experience and can say, like, I've used this, I've been able to maintain my life, I've been able to reach my goals. I'm not just sitting at home on my couch doing nothing. And I think that gives that hope and belief that it will be something that could facilitate these athletes, moving into retirement, and not how we see a lot of them where they struggle to find their footing in their identity. Maybe this would be something that would allow them to have a more fruitful life when they, exit that elite arena. But I think, again, it's that ongoing work in the clinical world to figure out how to work with a provider to figure out what it is you need, rather than going to one of these, offices where, yep, you just get a prescription and you're off and you can do whatever you want with it. It's kind of fine tuning that system to figure out how it can be beneficial for them. And I'm hopeful that with ongoing work like hers and, people that she works with, we'll be able to see more recommendations and good medical guidelines about how to provide this to people.
So on that note, and we'll get you out on this last question. Today is November 28th, 2023. Do you see a day in time, whether it's next week, next month, 10 years from now, do you see a day in time where not just here in the US, but globally, marijuana is no longer on any banned substance list at any level of any sport, and is just accepted and allowed in the same way that so many other substances are these days? Obviously for those 18 and up, because there's obviously still just same thing with all those, there's still legal rules involved. But do you see a day and time where it will just be not viewed as a big deal anymore and it'll just be allowed?
Yeah, I think a couple factors that will play into that. The legality, I think, will continue to be an issue, especially considering international play, things like the Olympics. You're going to always be struggling against the legal status of the countries that these competitions are being held in. So I think, that is going to be a barrier that would have to be overcome. And I think the other big thing that we're going to have to see here in the US is FDA involvement. Right now, the FDA doesn't regulate CBD products. So even if you go to the store, buy a CBD product that says it has no THC in it, that's very unlikely. There's been a lot of research that finds that there's even still very small amounts of THC in a lot of those products. And so I think until we have those regulatory systems to be able to know exactly what people are getting, to make sure that, we're not going to have an athlete traveling internationally and getting in legal trouble, I think we will continue to fight that. Do I think from a benefit standpoint, from a acceptability standpoint, it will be much more positively regarded and could be moved through in that realm? 100%. I think that that's definitely on the horizon, and I think we're going to see people following suit with that. I think it's just going to be those big barriers, getting more medical knowledge and understanding, working on the legal aspects, and getting better regulation to make sure that athletes and anyone who uses a CBD product can be safe and know what they're getting and make sure that they're actually getting what they believe that they are.
All right, Dr. Natalie Klag, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at The Ohio State University. Thank you so much for joining me today and talking about this topic.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure. Always fun to talk with you.
All right, that'll do it for today's show. Thank you so much to Dr. Natalie Klag for joining me once again. If you liked what you heard today, don't forget to please like, subscribe, rate, review, whether you're watching us on YouTube, listening to us on Spotify, or anywhere else you may be getting your podcasts. Really quick one, the last thing I would like to say, though, before we get out is every week I do like to end the show, as you guys know by now, taking a minute to remind everyone that it is okay not to be okay, and talking about ways that you or a loved one can get help if you or them are not doing well. So on that note, I would like to take a moment to kind of shout out or talk about Sam Girard. Sam Girard is a defenseman for the Colorado Avalanche in the NHL over the Thanksgiving holiday. Sam announced he was entering the Player Assistance Program with the NHL through the NHL and its Players Association. And through him and his representatives and his agent at CAA, we learned that the reason why he's taking a step back and entering into that program is that he suffers from severe anxiety and depression. And so he's stepping away to get the help that he needs. And so in the full statement that was released on Twitter, it says here, I have made a proactive decision to take care of my mental health and will be entering treatment for severe anxiety and depression that has gone untreated for too long and led to alcohol abuse. Taking care of your mental health is of the utmost importance, and I encourage anyone to speak up and seek help should you feel you need it. I want to express my gratitude to my wife, family, friends, the club, my teammates, and the fans for their patience, understanding, and continued support. So kudos to Sam for not just accepting and realizing and acknowledging, too, in public that he had that problem, but seeking help and also opening up, like I mentioned, and being open about it and vulnerable about it in public and sharing what he was going through. And like I would say, it's a great reminder, once again, that it is okay not to be okay. But like Sam, if you are or a loved one is struggling, please go get the help that you need so that you can be happy and healthy and get to enjoy the life to the fullest extent that you can. So that will do it for this week's show. Have a great week, everyone. We'll talk to you later.